The summer of 1973 was dry enough to crack the earth in Harlan County, Kentucky, and Earl Bodine knew, the way a man knows when his knee aches before a storm, that the dry would not last. He was 61 years old, and he had been reading this land since before he could read words. His father had farmed these same 280 acres. His grandfather had cleared the timber from the eastern ridge. The soil knew his boots, and he knew its moods. And that summer, watching the hard pan bake under a white July sky, he felt something the weather reports would not catch for another 6 weeks. So he picked up a spade, not a crew, not a contractor, not a county drainage permit. A spade, a wheelbarrow, a coil of string, and a set of hand-drawn lines on a piece of graph paper he had worked out over 3 evenings at his kitchen table. With a kerosene lamp and a cup of cold coffee and 40 years of watching where water went when it had nowhere to go. He began digging in the first week of August. Shallow channels, 12 inches wide and 10 inches deep, running at careful angles across the lower fields. Not straight, not the way a machine would cut them. Curved, following the natural contour of the land, the way a stream follows the path of least resistance. He dug 8 hours a day, moving slowly, testing the grade with a handheld level every 6 feet, adjusting the line when the ground told him to adjust. His neighbor's boy, 16 years old, stopped his bicycle on the road and watched for 10 minutes without saying anything. Then he rode on. Earl dug. Dale Pruitt arrived on a Tuesday morning in a Greene County truck with the seal of the Harlan County Agricultural Extension Office stenciled on the door. He was 34 years old, had a degree from the University of Kentucky's College of Agriculture, and had been the county agent for 2 years. He wore clean boots. He drove a clean truck. He carried a clipboard with printed forms that had boxes for everything. He had come to discuss Earl's fall planting schedule, a routine visit, nothing more, and he spotted the ditches from the road before he even pulled into the lane. He stood at the edge of the field for a long moment. Earl was 30 yards out, bent over his spade, working a new line toward the lower fence. "Mr. Bodine," Dale called. Earl straightened, turned, and walked back to the fence line without hurrying. Dale looked at the channels. He looked at the graph paper Earl had folded in his shirt pocket. He looked at the wheelbarrow, the hand level, the string lines still staked across the uncut section. "You dug these yourself," Dale said. "Yep, all of them." "Still going," Earl said. Dale walked along the fence, looking at the lines of the channels, the way they curved and intersected and moved toward the lower corner of the field, where a natural depression ran toward the creek. He had the expression of a man who has found something he did not expect to find. Not impressed, but genuinely puzzled, the way a person looks at a piece of furniture arranged in an odd but possibly intentional way. Then he smiled. It was a patient smile, the kind that carries professional courtesy on the surface and something less patient underneath. "Mr. Bodine, the county installed a tiled drainage system along Route 9 corridor 3 years ago. The lateral lines cover most of this watershed. You're already in the service area." "I know that," Earl said. "Then," Dale gestured at the ditches, "these aren't really necessary. Open channels like this, hand-dug, they'll erode. You'll lose topsoil every time you get a moderate rain. The county system handles runoff up to a 50-year event. That's the engineering standard." 50-year event, Earl repeated. "That's correct." Earl looked at his field. He looked at the sky. Then he looked at Dale Pruitt, the way a man looks at a clock that is showing the wrong time. Not angry, just aware of the discrepancy. "I appreciate you stopping," Earl said. Dale wrote something on his clipboard. "I'd recommend filling these back in before fall planting. Open channels will interfere with your equipment lanes, and you'll have erosion issues come spring." He clicked his pen. The county system will handle what comes. That's what it's designed for." He drove away in the clean green truck. Earl picked up his spade. He dug for 3 more weeks. By the time he finished, he had cut 1,400 linear feet of channel across his lower 180 acres. Each line graded at a 2% slope, moving water by gravity toward 4 collection points he had identified from memory. Low corners, natural swales, places where water always gathered after a hard rain and always stayed too long. From those 4 points, wider outlet channels carried the flow toward the creek bank, cut deep enough to move volume, but gradual enough not to scour. He lined the steeper sections with flat stones pulled from the eastern fence row, stones his grandfather had piled there clearing the field 60 years before. He packed the banks with cut sod, turned grass. Side down, an old technique for stabilizing a new channel that no agricultural textbook from 1973 mentioned, but that worked the same as it always had. When he was finished, he walked the entire system one evening at dusk, following each channel from its highest point to its outlet. He poured a coffee can of water at the head of each line and watched where it went. He adjusted 2 grades with a shovel and a half-hour of work. Then he went inside and ate supper. His wife, Clara, watched him from the kitchen window while he walked the ditches. She had not asked him why he was doing it. After 38 years, she had learned that when Earl Bodine worked on something with that particular quietness, the explanation came later and was always worth waiting for. The rain began on the 14th of September. It came in from the southwest, a slow-moving system that the radio stations described as a stationary front and the old-timers described as the sky not being able to hold any more. It rained all of that Tuesday. It rained Wednesday. Thursday brought 2 inches before noon and 3 more by midnight. The ground, baked hard all summer, could not absorb it fast enough. Water sheeted across the fields, looking for channels, looking for low places, looking for anywhere to go. The county's tiled drainage system, designed for the typical runoff rates of a moderate Kentucky storm, began moving water as designed, and then began to fall behind. By Friday morning, the tile outlets along Route 9 were running full bore and backing up. The lateral lines, buried 3 feet down, were overwhelmed by soil saturation levels they had not been built to handle. Water that should have entered the tile system was finding no entry pressure differential and staying on top of the ground instead. The rain did not stop. By Saturday, the Green River at Greensburg had risen 11 feet above its normal late summer level. The county emergency office opened a telephone hotline. The radio ran continuous farm reports. Somewhere between Harlan and the state line, a creek that had never flooded in living memory went over its banks and crossed a state road. On Earl Bodine's farm, the ditches were running. He was up before dawn Saturday, moving through the rain in his canvas coat and rubber boots, checking each outlet point with a flashlight. The channels were carrying water steadily, not overwhelmed, not eroding, moving. The stone-lined sections were holding their grade perfectly. The sod banks were intact. He cleared one outlet point where a clump of weed material had lodged against a stone, freeing the flow with a single push of a stick. He walked the entire system in the dark and the rain and found nothing else that needed attention. The water moved. He went inside and ate breakfast. Dale Pruitt had not slept since Thursday. He was running between farm visits across the eastern half of the county, taking calls on a radio that crackled with reports he did not want to hear. The McAllister operation, 600 acres of corn in the bottomland, had standing water 18 inches deep across the lower third. Their drainage system, installed new in 1971 at a cost of $34,000, had stopped functioning Friday afternoon when the tile outlets backed up into the main drainage ditch, which itself had overflowed. The corn was standing in water. At $1.60 per bushel and a projected yield of 140 bushels per acre, the math was simple and devastating. The Prentice Dairy Farm had water in the lower hay barn. 2 of the 4 equipment sheds on the Cutter property were flooded. The Harlan County road crew had been out since Thursday, diverting water from 3 road washouts, and the county engineer had already told Dale that the Route 9 drainage corridor, the engineered, tiled, modern system Dale had cited to Earl Bodine 6 weeks earlier, was operating at 140% of design capacity and was failing in 3 locations. Dale drove past Earl Bodine's front gate on Saturday afternoon without stopping. He had too many calls, too many crises, too many farmers losing too much. He almost didn't look, but he looked. He stopped the truck. He sat there in the rain for a full minute, looking at what he saw, and what he saw did not make immediate sense to him, so he sat there longer. Earl Bodine's lower fields were not flooded. Across the road, the Johnston property had water standing knee-deep in the corn rows. Beyond the tree line to the north, the Pettit Farm's bottomland had become a continuous lake. The entire valley was surrendering to the water in the way that overwhelmed land always surrenders, all at once, as if a decision had been made. But on Earl's fields, the water was moving, not standing, moving, following those shallow channels, those hand-dug, graph-paper-planned, stone-lined channels that Dale Pruitt had gently recommended filling back in, and finding its way to the outlet points and draining toward the creek in a controlled, steady flow that the fields could sustain. Dale turned into the lane and drove up to the house. Earl came to the door before Dale knocked. He had heard the truck. He held the door open and Dale stepped inside, dripping, and stood in the entrance of the kitchen where Clara had a pot of coffee on and a radio running weather reports in the corner. Dale took off his hat. He looked at the floor for a moment. "Your fields are draining," he said. "Yep," Earl said. "The county system failed yesterday afternoon along the Route 9 corridor. The McAllister place has 18 inches of standing water across their bottom corn. Prentice has water in the hay barn." Dale turned his hat in his hands. "I drove past your gate, and your fields are draining." Earl poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table. Dale sat down. He was not a bad man. He was a young man who had been trained in engineering standards and certification requirements and county budget processes, and those things were real and necessary, and they had also been completely insufficient, and he was sitting in a farmhouse kitchen trying to hold both of those facts at the same time. "How did you know?" Dale asked. "In August. How did you know this was coming?" Earl sat down across from him. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "My father lost the lower 40 acres in 1936, he said. "Flash flood off the ridge, came down faster than anyone expected. He stood in that field after the water went down and looked at the damage and told me something I was 10 years old and barely listening, but I heard it anyway." Earl paused. He said, "Son, water doesn't go where you want it to go. It goes where it's already going. Your job is to find out where it's going and help it get there before it decides on its own." Dale looked at his coffee. "The county system," Earl continued, "moves water where the engineers decided it should go. Straight lines, buried tile, design capacity based on average rainfall events. That's fine for average. But the land under my lower fields has 4 natural low points where water has been gathering since before my grandfather cleared this timber. You can bury a tile system, and it works fine until the system gets more than it was built for, and then the water goes back to where it was always going anyway. Except now it's got nowhere to go because you filled in the natural channels and compacted the soil around the tiles, and the outlets are backed up." He set his cup down. "I just helped it get where it was already going." Dale Pruitt was quiet for a long time. "I told you to fill those ditches in," he said. You did. I said the county system was sufficient. You did. I was wrong. You were working with what you'd been taught, Earl said. Your system is right for most of what happens. I was planning for what happens when most isn't enough. The rain stopped on Sunday evening, 41 hours after it had started. The final measurement at the Harlan County Weather Station recorded 9.4 inches over 4 days, the heaviest sustained rainfall event in recorded county history, a figure that would later cause several agricultural engineers to quietly revise the phrase 50-year event in their working documents. The damage assessments began Monday morning. The McAllister operation lost an estimated $180,000 in corn, 112 acres drowned beyond recovery, the remainder damaged enough to reduce yield by 40%. Their new drainage system would require excavation and re-engineering at a cost the county agent's office was not yet ready to calculate. The Prentice hay barn had 3 feet of standing water and a foundation crack that would need to be addressed before winter. 14 farms across the eastern county reported significant crop loss. The county road crew spent 11 days on washout repairs. The Route 9 drainage corridor required emergency dredging at 3 locations before it could function at normal capacity again. Earl Bodine's 280 acres sustained no crop loss. His channels had moved an estimated 2.1 million gallons of excess water over the 4-day event, a figure that the University of Kentucky Extension Office would later calculate when they came to photograph and measure the system. His soil structure in the lower fields showed no significant erosion damage. The stone-lined sections had held perfectly. The sod banks had not sloughed. 2 outlet channels had widened slightly at their connection points with the creek bank, which he repaired in an afternoon with a spade and a load of flat stones from the fence row. He had $0 in flood damage. He had $340 in materials, the string, the hand level, a new spade handle mid-project, and the coffee he drank while drawing the plans. Dale Pruitt came back on Wednesday, this time with a camera and a notebook. He walked the entire system with Earl, who explained every decision, the curve of each channel, the grade calculation, the choice of outlet locations, the stone lining technique, the sod bank method. Dale wrote everything down. He asked careful, genuine questions. He did not write on a clipboard this time. He wrote in a plain spiral notebook, the kind a student uses, and he wrote quickly, the way a person writes when they are afraid of losing something important. At the lower outlet, the main collection point where 3 channels merged into the primary drainage run toward the creek, Dale stopped and looked at the water still flowing steadily 3 days after the rain had ended, the last of the groundwater draining slowly through the system, the fields releasing what they had absorbed. "How long have you known how to do this?" Dale asked. "I watched my father do it," Earl said. "He watched his father. The techniques go back further than that, before drainage tile was invented, before any of the modern systems. Farmers had to move water somewhere, and they had to do it by reading the land because they didn't have engineers telling them where the water was supposed to go. And it still works. Water still runs downhill, Earl said. That part hasn't changed." Dale closed his notebook. He looked at the field, green and intact, the rows still visible, the soil structure unbroken, the crop standing where a crop should stand after 4 days of historic rain. "I owe you an apology," Dale said. "A real one, not a professional one." Earl looked at him. "I stood in this field in August," Dale said, "and I told you that what you were doing was unnecessary and that you should fill it in. I was condescending. I had 2 years of experience and a degree and a county truck, and I talked to you like you were behind the times." He paused. "You were building the only thing in this county that worked when everything else failed, and I told you to stop." Earl was quiet for a moment. "You weren't wrong about the county system under normal conditions," he said finally. "I'm not saying the modern approach is worthless. I'm saying it has a limit, and the limit is what the engineers planned for. When you go past that limit, you'd better have something under it." "A foundation," Dale said. "Something like that?" They shook hands at the fence line. A long shake, the kind where neither man lets go immediately, where something is passed between them that doesn't have a name, but both of them feel it. Dale Pruitt looked Earl Bodine in the eye for a moment that lasted 1 second longer than a professional handshake requires. Then he got in his truck and drove back toward the county with a notebook full of things his degree had not taught him. By the following Sunday, the story had moved through the community the way all important stories move through farming communities, without newspaper coverage, without announcements, simply by word of mouth along the channels that rural people have always used, at the co-op in town, at the feed store on Route 9, in the parking lot after church. Someone told someone who told someone else, and within a week, every farmer in Harlan County had heard the basic shape of it. Earl Bodine dug his ditches by hand all summer. The county agent told him to stop. The flood came. Every modern drainage system in the valley failed, and Earl's fields drained clean. The McAllister family came out on a Thursday. Gerald McAllister, who had farmed 600 acres and installed a $34,000 drainage system and lost $180,000 in 4 days of rain, stood at Earl's fence line and looked at the channels for a long time without speaking. He was not a man who easily admitted to anything. But he had stood in knee-deep water in his own corn rows for 2 days, watching his yield drown. And that does something to a man's willingness to reconsider. He asked Earl to walk him through it. Earl walked him through it. Gerald asked 3 questions, each one more technical than the last, and Earl answered all 3 in plain language without hesitation. Gerald thanked him, shook his hand, and went home. The following spring, he hired 2 men with hand tools and spent 6 weeks cutting a secondary drainage network across his lower bottomland, following the natural contour lines, positioning outlet points at the 4 low places on his property where water had always gathered when the main system was overwhelmed. He did not put in another tile system. He put in ditches. Dale Pruitt changed the way he conducted farm visits. It was not dramatic. There was no announcement, no public declaration, no letter to the Extension office describing a change in methodology. He simply began doing something he had not done before. He asked questions before he made recommendations. Specifically, he began asking farmers how water moved on their land during extreme events. Not during normal rainfall, not during the engineered design conditions, but during the worst thing they had seen. He asked what had failed and where. He asked what had held. He kept the spiral notebook in his truck. He filled it over the following 2 years and started a second one. He kept a photograph on his desk. He had taken it on that Wednesday visit, a wide shot of Earl Bodine's lower field from the fence line, the channels still carrying the last of the flood drainage 3 days after the rain had ended, the crop rows visible and intact in the background. Not a dramatic photograph, just a field doing what a field is supposed to do, held together by a system that cost $340 and a summer of quiet, unhurried work. When young agents came through on training rotations, fresh from the university, new boots, clipboards, Dale showed them the photograph before he showed them anything else. He did not explain it extensively. He let them look at it. Then he told them the story. And then he said one thing that was not in any training manual or engineering standard or county extension publication. He said, "Before you tell a farmer what the system is designed to handle, ask him what he has seen happen when the system reaches its limit. Because somewhere in this county there is always a man who has already been planning for that." Earl Bodine went back to his farm. He repaired the 2 outlet points that had widened slightly during the flood. An afternoon's work with the spade and the stones from the fence row. He walked the full system one final time in October, when the ground was dry again and the channels showed their geometry clearly, and he found nothing that needed attention beyond one section of sod bank that had partially slumped, which he repacked in 20 minutes. He planted his fall cover crop on schedule, on undamaged ground, in soil that had shed a 100-year flood without losing its structure. He did not give interviews. He did not attend the county emergency debrief that the Extension Office organized in November, where agricultural engineers reviewed the drainage failures and discussed revisions to the design standards. He had not been invited, and he would not have gone anyway. He had nothing to add to that kind of meeting. The people in that meeting were drawing conclusions he had already lived. Clara asked him once, that winter, if he thought about what would have happened if he had listened to the county agent and filled the ditches in. He thought about it for a moment. "I'd have lost the lower fields," he said. "Maybe more." "Does it bother you that he told you to stop and you kept going anyway?" Earl set down his coffee cup and looked out the kitchen window at the fields, white with the first frost of December, the channel lines just visible as slight shadows across the flat ground of the lower acres. "He was doing his job," Earl said. "He believed what he'd been taught. That's not a fault. The fault would have been believing it myself when the land was telling me something different." Clara nodded and refilled his cup. He watched his fields through the window until the light went flat and the frost disappeared into the gray of the afternoon. The ditches were still there. They would still be there in the spring. They would still be there the next time the sky decided it had held enough.